Hello, welcome to my podcast and my YouTube channel. Today I have someone very special for me because he was my professor, full disclosure. So I'm just going to start saying that. He taught me a lot about shame because shame is one of these things that you think you know what it is because it's such a common word, but everybody uses it. But then I took a class with him called Shame and Grace, and that really helped me understand shame in a new way. And this is what we're going to focus our conversation on. So here he is, my dear professor Richard Shaw. He was known at George Fox University. He is a professor at George Fox University here in Portland, Oregon. He's also a licensed counselor here. And like many of us, his office right now is full because COVID has really done that. Unfortunately, a lot of mental health issues. But we're going to talk about specifically shame today because it's so important for my audience, Dr. Shaw. For both, my audience is mainly people who are at risk for suicide and also those who have lost loved ones to suicide, and shame is in both of them, right? For us who lose loved ones and for those who are contemplating, unfortunately, suicide. So let's talk about this. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you, Paula. I'm happy to be here. So, yeah, I've known Paula for a number of years and had her in class, and that was a joy as well. And we've continued a relationship since then. So when you reached out, Paula, to have me do this, I was just thrilled to do it. I've been studying shame and grace for between 25 and 30 years at this point. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on it 25 years ago, and what's interesting is that along the way, I thought, it was something that was fascinating to me, that made sense to me, that answered some questions for me, but this is probably going to go away. It's not going to be that important, right? It's not going to be on the front burner of things. And I didn't expect it to be one of the driving factors, turn into a class. I'm actually writing the book this year, hoping for that to come out next year on the topic. And we must give Brene Brown credit. I think she helped
Yeah.
make
She
sure that
opened the door, right?
she did. She made sure we
Yeah.
all know what that is. But the concept of shame, just the heart of shame, is this sense that I'm never enough, Paula, that there's something deeply wrong with me, that I'm never enough. And that can be in the way I look, in the way I perform or I don't perform. It could be at work. It can be in my major relationships. It can be in my spiritual world, in my family. There are so many experiences that happen all the time where we just conclude there's something wrong with me. I don't measure up. I'm just not enough.
Hmm. You know, Dr. Shaw, I read, I don't know where, because I've been reading a lot about this, and I read the book by Brené Brown that we had to read for class.
Yes.
But I read something that really struck me, and it made so much sense to me. It says, shame is at its essence a fear of disconnection.
Disconnection is a key element, relational pieces. I mean, I'm a marriage and family therapist, so I'm always interested in connection with others. And one author says that shame is the ultimate disconnect in relationship. Think about intimacy, think about connection, think about any time in depth that we share our soul, our person with someone else. Well, shame tells me I'm not good enough. There's something wrong with me. And so my walls go up. I cover myself. I protect myself. And how can we do deep intimacy and connection and love when we're trying to protect ourselves? Because that's exactly the opposite of being able to be in that safe space relationally with other people.
Yes, and also it stops you from having the capacity to be vulnerable, right? Because if you're
No
always
question.
protecting yourself and always guarding yourself, I think that shame, in a way, you were saying I'm just never good enough. So if you believe that you're never good enough, you will never show who you are, right? Because they will see that I'm never good enough. So it really impacts relationship deeply, doesn't it?
So another author says that two of the most classic ways that we'll see shame is that we either get big or we get small. So people that get big, right, they get powerful and they want to take control and they want to dominate, and that's their coping mechanism. And it's hard to connect deeply or be vulnerable with somebody who's getting big, right? They have to call the shots, they've got to be in control and in charge. Or we get small, which is that, I just want to disappear. I'm sad. I just want to blend into the woodwork, and I don't want to stand out in any way because I don't want to be seen. So getting big and getting small, you can't help but be seen all the time because you're so big and you're so present that you're covering up for that vulnerable place, or you feel so small and so vulnerable and so hurt and sad that you just don't even want anybody to see you.
And then all these labels come up, right? Because I'm thinking of the two poles that you just mentioned. So the one who goes big sometimes can be seen as someone who's aggressive or even a narcissist, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Or arrogance. That's how it
Yes.
shows too, putting
Yeah,
people
no
down
question.
sometimes.
Absolutely. So any way to distance the self from other people, and all of those ways, let me turn it on its ear. None of those ways draw people toward you, right? They do exactly the opposite. They push people away, which is exactly what they want because they're afraid. Part of the heart of shame, along with not being enough, is fear. And when I talk about fear, sometimes that doesn't make sense to people. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to men. They're like, I don't fear anything, I'm strong and big. And I'm like, no, that emotional fear, like you just said, the ability to be real, to be vulnerable, to let my guard down and be known, to go to my feelings. A lot of people, shame gets in the way, and that's so fearful to think about doing those things that they react against it because that's just so scary to think about, Paula.
Yeah. And the other one, the one who hides from people, they can be seen as introverts, right? No, he's just shy, right?
Introvert and it's interesting because I'm an extrovert, so I have to do a good job for my introvert friends, Paula, on this one. Certainly, there are people that just have personality traits that they're introverted, but it is interesting that shame and introvertism, there is some connection there. And so sometimes somebody who isn't introverted comes off introverted because they don't want to be seen, they don't want to stand out in any way, they're fearful, and their shame keeps them quiet and hidden and alone and cut off. And so being able to make a distinction between a true introvert and a person who's kind of using those introvert ways as a coping mechanism from shame. There can be some overlap there. We have to tease those two out, but absolutely there's a connection with those two things.
So I'm just thinking now of the listener who's going, yeah, that's me. So let's help them understand why that is. So, what creates shame?
So, great question. What doesn't create shame? For me, I have become such a believer. You know this, Paula. I am all in 100%. Shame is such a powerful thing that literally we don't have a chance of getting to adulthood without being impacted by shame. We live in an imperfect world. We live in imperfect relationships, and even the hardest we try in our parenting and the ways we try to do our best and respect and love and care for one another and work. I mean, it's just impossible to get to adulthood without some level of shame. I routinely say that all of us have been impacted and touched through relational experiences by shame. Some of us a little bit, some of us a lot, and some in the middle. So some of us have been traumatized, and we could go down the road of significant relational ruptures and traumas. Shame comes from that. Others of us don't relate to that place of significant rupture or trauma, but maybe, like for me, it was just kind of everywhere. It was in my family, it was in the community, it was in my church, it was in my friendships. And just that sense of never being enough just kind of permeated. I kind of call it
Mm-hmm.
the soup of shame. It was just kind of everywhere. And so no major traumas, but just all the time, never enough, never enough, never enough. And then the rest of us fall somewhere between those things. Maybe we've had some traumas or had some other experiences where shame became the lead place. But parenting, significant relationships, work, school, teachers, neighbors, all kinds of brokennesses end up, for many of us, touching on or encouraging and enticing, kind of bringing that sense that I kind of already felt like I wasn't enough. And now something happened that reinforced that. And then it grows and it becomes a belief in my mind that I really am not enough, Paula. There really is something wrong or broken with me.
And it can be related to culture, can't it? Because I'm thinking about the moment we're going through right now, the Black Lives Matter
Yes.
and everything that's going on. So one of the things for those who have that in them, and it really impacts their relationships and how they see themselves, um, lifelong discrimination. That's one of the things, isn't it?
So I'm really glad you mentioned that. Again, this material that I'm going to share here, I worked on 25 years ago, and yet one of the elements is as real today as ever. And so in some of the original research, I came up with a list out of the research of 8 things that we can see that let us know that there's shame stuff going on. So control issues,
Hmm.
perfectionism, blame, denial, unreliability. That is, we can't depend on people in relationships to follow through or do or say what they say they're going to do. Disqualification, addictions, and rage. Those are 8 characteristics that often show up in our key relationships that help us track back to shame. And what you just talked about with culture, the disqualification piece has to do with power and the lack of power. It has to do with privilege. It has to do with who gets to be the one calling the shots or in charge. And so disqualification, there's something wrong with you, something wrong with your culture. You're not good enough. You're not at the same level. And we have the power or the authority or the privilege, and we use that over you because you're different. That disqualification is a key element in shame. So absolutely, that makes perfect sense as a part of what happens in us.
Yeah, can you give us an example? You just gave us 8. We could do maybe 10 podcasts, one of each, right? On those 8 items. But can you give us an example that we have not touched on that is a part of that list?
So um, uh, I'm going to call this guy's George. George
Mhm.
came in to see me a number of years ago, and on the outside, he looked like he had it all together, Paula. Literally, he was dressed appropriately. He looked sharp. I saw out the window he drove up in a nice car. I know the community that I'm in and he's from, and he lived from the right community. He had the right job. He made good money, beautiful wife and family. I mean, you would never know that there were any issues. So he comes in to see me in counseling. And for a number of weeks, I'm asking myself, why is this guy even here? He acts like he's got it all together. Uh, Getting big, right? As a
Mm,
show of
yeah.
not having shame. And then maybe 6 weeks, which was pretty amazing, 8 weeks into counseling, 1 week, I could tell something was different. And he just
Mm,
came in and he was really quiet and sullen, and he didn't make eye contact with me. And he just sat down and he started talking about his background and the family he grew up in. He started talking about the alcoholism, the abuse, and the trauma. He talked about being raised on the wrong side of the tracks. He was small and little, and he could never defend himself. He got beat up all the time as a young boy in school.
Wow.
And he started opening up all these pictures of his family of origin, his trauma, the abuse, the alcohol, his stature, and the way that he saw himself. And on the outside, he was this successful adult that had everything going. In fact, he told me all the time, I'm a winner, I'm winning all the time. And then he let that go that one week, and he let me see behind that. And this is so touching. It moved my heart. That session, he said, Dr. Shaw, every night, my wife and I go in and we give a little kiss on the forehead of our little girls, and we pray for them and we tuck them in, and we do that perfect little family moment. And he goes, then later, about an hour later, when I go to bed and they're asleep, he said, I go back into their rooms and this is absolutely true, Paul. It's the saddest thing you've ever heard. He said, I whisper into my little girl's ears, honey, I pray that when you grow up, you don't meet and marry someone like me.
Oh my God.
That's what was on the inside. And yet on the outside, he would never let anybody get close to that. But once he did, he trusted me in that space and he allowed me in there. And we started going toward those ruptures, those traumas, that background, and doing some healing and work on that. Started making small changes where he was more authentic, not just big or small, but being able to really understand who he was, that he was enough, and that he was in process of growing and changing and getting healing. And so we ended up working together for over 6 months as a part of that shame process for him.
You know, I mean, as therapists, of course, you know that, but so many people have this mask, right, of having the perfect life. I actually interviewed someone, and the title of the episode is The Masks We Wear, because he was exactly what you just said, very awarded winning, very happy in his marriage, had everything, quote unquote, and one day he attempted suicide. And I asked him because one of the things he told me was, and I was very surprised to see that my wife was supportive. And that just didn't strike right to me. And I said, why do you say surprised? And he said, because I don't think I ever really trusted anyone. And it was just never enough. I mean, no matter how many awards he got, you know, financial situation, the marriage, everything. He had a brother who his wife actually contacted the brother after the attempt and asked him to help, you know, support him. And that's when he started crying in the interview. And he said, and they actually saved my life. And now I believe, I do trust people. But there is this internal message that I'm not good enough. No matter what it doesn't matter what it looks like on the outside, right?
You're the expert on suicide, my friend. I am not. But I'll tell you that from a shame perspective, the ultimate statement of shame is a suicide attempt.
Yeah.
I am not good enough. And not only am I not good enough, I'm never going to be enough. And when that takes hold and becomes a truth that I believe and that gets reinforced, the depression, the hopelessness that's there, all of a sudden things are in a tunnel and I have no options. I can't see truth. I can't see what's real. I can't see the good. And ultimately, a person concludes, what difference does it make? I don't make a difference. Why am I even here? It's the ultimate statement of shame, is to say, I just don't even matter. And I'm just not going to be here. I'm going to go away.
Yeah, it makes so much sense what you just said, because it drives a person to capital letter hopelessness. And that's central in suicide.
It's so difficult. And I'm going to keep this really quick because I don't want to bore anybody. I got to tell you though, the model that I found that I love is called restoration therapy.
Therapy. Yeah.
And you've already mentioned some of the pieces. Love and trust are the key elements. And love is about identity. Who am I? And trust is all about vulnerability. Can I really be who I am in relationship with others? Love and trust, identity and vulnerability. When those things are in place and we can provide that for someone, we're in a healing space and place to help somebody move forward.
Well, you talked about healing. I just have a couple of questions because I always want to give my audience some tools, because not all of them can go to therapy, and sometimes it's just not accessible. But before we go there, because I do want to explore healing, how can they help themselves or find some path towards healing? I want to, because it's very common for us, and this is something I learned with you, because I used to think it was the same thing, but can you tell us the difference between shame and guilt?
So guilt, and you're absolutely right. These two terms get overlapped with each other, and people will use one or the other and not exactly know what it is they're saying. Often they use guilt and shame interchangeably to talk about shame, but guilt is about behaviors. It's about what I do or I don't do. It's about accountability. It's about taking responsibility for what I do or I don't do in the world. And then if I make a mistake, I correct it. I'm accountable for it. I forgive it. I offer forgiveness or receive it. And then I let it go and move on. So it doesn't have to scar me. Guilt is about my behaviors. Shame is my person. It's about my soul. It's about my person. And that's why when a person tries to do a repair around shame and they don't feel good afterwards, it's a shame place. It's not a guilt place, right? If I steal a candy bar and then decide that that was something I did wrong, and I make restitution, I pay for it, I pay for it in some way, then I'm guilty. My conscience told me I did something wrong. I took accountability for it and I corrected it and I move on. That's guilt. When I try to do a process with shame, sometimes I actually feel worse after than I did before. So I try to do the repair and I still feel like, oh, I should do more. I should do more. Well, that wasn't enough. There's something wrong with me. And so that's a shame place. That's a deeper place. That's a core place, a person place that says I'm not enough and I can't get it corrected.
That makes a lot of sense. And the way that I think about it too is that shame is something that turns you inwardly. It's about who you are, the core of your self-image.
Yes.
And guilt, it's outside of you. So it's about relationships, it's about others. So it can actually be a protective factor to shame, right? Because you can, as you said, you can repair. And so for relationships, that can be a positive thing. But shame it's about going inwards.
It is. It's an internal space, and depending on how you think about it, for me, it becomes truths that I tell myself. It becomes lies that I tell myself. It becomes the messages that get trapped in my brain that tell me who I am or who I'm not. And so that internal process gets reinforced, and I start to have like a shame grid. I start to believe certain things about myself. And if I believe I'm a shameful person, there's something wrong with me on the inside, probably at some point, it's going to show up on the outside. It's going to show up in my behaviors, even if I cover it up, like we talked about earlier. Guilt is about relationship and correction with others. Shame is that space we go into on the inside that often says, I'm not
Mhm.
good enough and nothing I can do will help me not be that shame place.
Mhm. The other word that comes to mind for me is low self-esteem. So is that related to shame? I believe it is. It may be a
It
synonym,
is.
right?
Yeah, I think that they're
Sometimes.
really, really related. And I think actually, I think I would say it this way. I think low self-esteem probably was the language that got used maybe before we used the shame language in
Hmm.
the same kind of way today.
Yeah.
And I think so low self-esteem is about how a person thinks about themselves, sees themselves, and definitely can be very related or connected or actually certainly be used in a really similar way.
Hmm. Is there a connection, Dr. Shaw, between shame and mental illness?
So shame shows up in the literature connected to addiction issues. It shows up around
Mhm.
depression issues. It shows up around anxiety issues. It shows up around relationship issues, which becomes significant others, and parenting. And that's about what my practice is, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
everything that walks in my door. So shame often, I've said for years, nobody walks into my office and says their presenting problem is shame. It's
Of
all those
course. Yeah.
other things. But what's underneath all those other things often is shame. So,
Hmm.
yes, shame is often the heart of what's behind the struggles, the presenting problems, the issues in life that are not going the way we want them to. It's very connected.
Hmm.
That's why I'm getting kind of excited here, Paula.
It's
That's
okay.
why that's why we have to do either on ourselves or with others or in some kind of group environment, we have to do some of that deeper work, Paula, on that shame place. Because if all we do is try to learn some new skills on the outside or make some
Mm.
kind of cognitive or only behavioral changes on
Mm.
the outside, it's not enough.
It's
It's a
not long lasting,
core,
right?
right? It's a core place in us about how we see ourselves, how we see the world, and whether we really believe I'm enough. That has to
Hmm.
be dealt with in order for me to then really make changes on the outside.
Hmm. Does it show in your experience and what you see in your practice, and of course all the research that I know you dig into all the time? Does it show differently in men and women?
So
And
what's interesting,
also, do they react differently too?
so one piece that I look at regularly with that, I'm turning to something, I've got some material on this here.
Hmm.
Brene Brown did a piece in one of her books on the differences between how shame shows up for men and women. And so I'm going to do two things with that. Just a little bit here. Brown says that women experience shame as a feeling in the pit of your stomach that's dark and hurts like hell. You can't talk about it, you can't articulate it. It feels so bad. It's like everybody knows your dirty little secret. It's about being rejected, it's about hating yourself. It's about being exposed and just wanting to hide or die. That's what Brene Brown says about how women experience shame.
Hmm.
And then men, she says, shame for men is weakness, never wanting to be seen or perceived as weak. It's about failure. It's about being wrong. It's about being soft or showing fear or being critiqued. The interesting thing, when I've shared those two lists with clients and in classes, you probably know what the feedback was, is even though we kind of parse that out gender wise, the truth is when you put it in the room, I've had men say, I relate to the list from the
Hmm.
women, and women say, I relate to the list from the men. So So yes, generally, I think there's some differences there, but certainly, I know I relate to things that are on both of those lists, and that's been my experience. Is it's not quite as clean to
Hmm.
parse that out based on men and women.
Hmm. But I would think that the way it shows up and how we react to it is different. Because I'm thinking about men, for example. You
Oh,
guys get it really hard because you can't show your emotion, right? Since you're a little kid, you tough it up and
right.
keep it in or
Be
whatever
strong.
you, yeah,
Yep.
be strong, don't be weak. Because
Yep.
it does have, I can totally understand the weakness part of it. But at
Yes.
the same time, the one emotion that's okay for men to show is aggression, right? You
Yeah.
can't
Anger.
cry, but you can be
Right.
aggressive. So I would
Exactly.
think that that has an impact on how you react to your shame, right?
Yeah, I think you're right as well. And remember, we talked about getting big versus getting small earlier. Can you imagine any way of getting bigger than being aggressive and angry, right? That's getting
Mm-hmm.
big. And that fits into what you're saying, which is kind of that acceptable feeling is you can get big with your shame. You can be aggressive. You can be angry. And that's how it shows often for men. Often for women, it's the opposite. They get small. They want to blend into the woodwork and they don't want to make any waves.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's get into the healing part. So it's
So
not all doom, my listeners. You know, we all have shame. Don't worry. But let's get into some tools or maybe ways of thinking, new perspectives. How can my listener help themselves or even someone they know, right? Because I'm sure many of them will go, yeah, that's my husband or my son or my daughter or my friend, or
right.
yeah, that sounds a lot like them. Because it's always harder for us to see ourselves, right? It's always somebody else.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I remember
So
Dr. Shaw. I remember when we did a lot of role playing in
yes.
class, and
Yes.
it was so obvious sometimes that they'll say, yeah, I have a friend. And I'm going, yeah, right, a friend. Yeah, I
We're
have
really
that friend
close.
too.
Exactly. I know
So
that
let's
guy,
say
right?
you listener have a friend
Uh,
who may be related to this. How can we help? How can we maybe examine it, explore these things, and maybe realize, okay, yeah, that's where it comes from.
so, and I mean this, Paula. This is for you. Honestly, the number one thing that all of us do is that we talk about it just like you're doing today, because shame thrives in hiddenness. Shame thrives in the dark, in the quiet. So, number one, we talk about our thoughts, our feelings, our hurts, those places where we feel like we're not enough. And obviously, we want to do that with somebody we feel safe with. Again, that can be our best friend, an accountability person, professionals, but having someone where we literally talk out loud is breaking the silence of that shame. That's so key. That's number one. And number two, speaking the truth out loud, Paula.
Why does that
Speaking
make a difference?
speaking the truth out loud, literally, this is crazy, Paula. It literally moves where things light up in your brain, because shame is often connected to those fight or flight places. And that's trapped in our reptilian brain at the back here. When we speak the truth out loud, we literally move that from the reptilian brain to the prefrontal cortex, and it's out of that fight and flight place where we can't do much with it. We literally practice emotional regulation. We calm our brain and ourself down, and then we have choices.
Hmm.
When we speak the truth out loud about how somebody treated me, what happened to me, what I'm thinking or feeling right now, speaking the truth out loud frees me up to then have the
Mhm.
opportunity to do something healthy, not just from a coping or a protection place. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. But just clarifying to the listeners, because they may not be very familiar with the term, but the prefrontal cortex is where logic happens, is when decision making happens. And that's what allows us to do something that I believe helps with shame, reality check, right? So you
Yes.
mentioned, for example, for men, criticizing, right?
Yep.
Critique. It's really hard for men to take that sometimes, and when it's in the reptilian brain, you react. You don't do any reality.
Absolutely.
You immediately react, maybe with aggression, maybe with saying, no, you're wrong, or just questioning the critique. But when it comes to the prefrontal cortex, you say, wow, does that make sense? Have I done this before? Maybe this is a pattern. So it's the logic thinking that you can moderate and make sense out of information without immediately reacting emotionally, right?
And in the Shame and Grace class, I talk about the difference between reacting versus responding, which is exactly what you're talking about, Paula. When we are emotionally reacting, the chances that we're going to do something healthy is really low. When we calm our system down, when we move that to the prefrontal cortex, when we have choices and we can make decisions and look at a bigger picture, we literally are taking deep breaths, slowing ourselves down, and being able to see a bigger picture and the truth, and then responding to that place appropriately. It matches. So the
Mhm.
event and the emotional response match, and that makes sense. It's more logical. And again, it's because we've calmed our emotional state down and we can see more clearly.
Mhm. The other thing that may help, and I want to hear your opinion on this, is trying to separate the shame that you feel from who you are. Is that something that helps?
So the heart of shame is there's something wrong with me, my person. The healing of shame is being able to acknowledge I'm a really good person, Paula. I was made and built as an amazing human being. And I'm flawed. I'm in process. I'm growing. I'm learning.
Mm-hmm.
I'm better today than I was yesterday. And that's kind of how this thing works, right? So we're growing and changing and evolving daily, weekly, yearly. And so it's not that there's something wrong with my person. The truth is, you're an awesome person who matters. And we're in process of growing and
Mm-hmm.
changing and learning every day.
Yeah, so you're not perfect because you mentioned that perfectionism is a way, right? To try to
Yes.
counter shame. And
I
just, oh, sorry,
am
go
not.
ahead.
I am not perfect, and I'm not going to
Mm-hmm.
pretend like I am. I'm going to be real with what I can do and what I can't, and what I'm learning and growing and what I'm trying to get better at.
Yeah, that's a great point you just made. What I can do, my limits, knowing your limits, because sometimes we overdo things because we're always trying to fill that hole of I'm not good enough, right? And you overdo things and things that you really are not capable of doing sometimes, and that just feeds the shame because again, see, I'm not good enough.
No. And even if we could continue to do that, it's not sustainable in the long run. We get exhausted. I can't keep
Mm.
up that show, that pretend of perfection or control. And so, number one, it's not sustainable emotionally. And then, number two, even if I can be super perfect person, the truth is, I know me. I
Mm.
know what I've done in the past. I know what I'm capable of, Paula. I know that even if I got you believing that I'm this perfect person, I know in my heart
You
of
can't
hearts
fool
that I'm
yourself,
not. I
right?
can't fool myself.
Mm-hmm. Knowing your triggers, is that a good one to pay attention
Oh,
to?
you have to be able to figure out, do I know myself? Do I know what pushes my buttons? So things like being invalidated or feeling like I'm not enough, that there's something wrong with me, that I don't matter. Being able to identify, where are the buttons of my soul that get pushed, where then I have a chance that I'm reacting instead of responding. So speaking the truth out loud, talking about my places of shame, identifying triggers. How about identifying moments and experiences where I feel like somebody's kind of shaming me?
Mm-hmm.
So I can actually put some words to what I'm thinking and feeling right now when I'm like, that person's not being very nice to me. They're critiquing me
Mm-hmm.
inappropriately. They're working out of their shame to make themselves feel better. And so being able to identify and put words to my thoughts, my feelings, my experiences, and what's happening in a relationship brings some reality, which is what you said earlier, to what's really going on or happening in this moment.
Yeah. Dr. Shaw, to end, I want to hear from you. Uh, I'm thinking about people like me who lost someone to suicide, and you know that suicide is such a huge stigma. No one wants to talk about it, and that's why I do this work. So the word is out there, and we fight this silence. But there is so much shame when we lose someone because society points a finger at you. The family members are the first one to be questioned. How could you not see this? Or parents, my God, I can't even think about parents. It breaks my heart because they blame themselves for the death, and society does that too. So what would you say to this part of my audience, those who lose, who are mourning the loss of someone to suicide? How can they deal, identifying the shame, and also deal with people when they do that?
So it's interesting, Paula, when you invited me into this process with you a number of weeks ago, I actually started working with a couple, and their presenting problem wasn't the suicide of their son. They came in for other stuff, but about 6 weeks in, they started going toward telling me the story of their teenage son who took his life just about a year and a half ago. And
Wow.
now every week, that's exactly what we're dealing with them. The things that you just said are exactly the things that they're struggling with. The questions, why couldn't we have seen this? What's wrong with us? Were we bad parents? Why couldn't we have seen it? Over and over. Number one, I help them tell their story. I listen with care and grace and authenticity. I let them have tears and cry and do the feelings that go with that. I'm connecting the two of them in care for one another. I'm affirming to them, you were good parents. Don't believe the lies that sometimes show up that tell you there was something wrong with you, or you should have caught it, or you should have known better. We're helping them process every week and let go of the fact that this was a teenage boy who had some of his own issues, that had his own struggles. There's no way they could have known all of that, and that he was dealing with his own stuff and making his own choices, probably struggling with his own shame and some of his own mental health issues, that there was no way to know all of what was going on in there. So I'm connecting the two of them together the best I can every moment. Literally, I have them hold hands
Mm,
when they're crying and connecting and being able to offer care to one another. I try to do that for them, but it's more powerful when they do it for themselves
of
and for
course,
one
yeah.
another. Yeah. So helping them know, this doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. You are enough. Your son made choices that ultimately no one could have stopped from happening, unless we're going to like put this kid in his room 24/7 and never let him
No,
live life.
no.
And that's not realistic. And so I'm just trying to let them know, I'm kind of loving on them and helping them love on each other. It's okay. You're enough. your good parents, and having them connect in care with each other. And there's tears, there's hugs, there's connection, there's love back there between them. And I'm just trying to give them
Mm.
space to just let them heal through this process.
And also, sometimes even when you're talking about you are enough and you are good parents, even if they did make a mistake again, doesn't mean you're perfect.
No one, no one is perfect. We can't do anything perfect enough or be in control enough. At the end of the day, Paula, every one of us is going to make choices that we're going to decide about, and our own process is going to be a part of that. And my parents or my kids or my best friends can only do so much. They can do
Mhm.
things, but ultimately, every one of us is responsible for some of our own stuff and what's happening inside of us. And shame often stops people from saying out loud what's really happening on the inside. That's why that starter place around suicide and around shame, being a person that somebody else can come to and say, I'm really struggling. I'm really hurting. I'm so alone. I don't know where to go or what to do. If we can be people that others can come to like that, Paula, we're going to get ahead of shame, and we're going to help save literally people's lives.
Dr. Shaw, such a precious, deep interview, conversation. Thank you so much for helping my audience. And let us know about your book. When is that coming up, huh?
I
I
will.
remember
I
back
will.
then I talked to you and said, you should write a book about this. No, but Brené Brown, no, there's need for more and there's room for more. And you have so much knowledge to, years and years of being a therapist, and that it's so many cases to mention. So I'm sure I'll be the first one there. Hopefully it will be after COVID so we can have like a line, right? For
Yes, right.
signing.
Exactly. Yeah, we're looking at probably next summer. So I've
Cool.
contracted with Lost Poet Publishing, and I think it's going to be called Shame No More. And I'm going to get the first drafts this fall. We're working with an editor and trying to put that together. So I hope to have it available next summer. And Paula, thank you so much for all you do and for inviting me on your podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'll make sure, not now, but when it comes up, I'll just edit the notes and I'll have a link to your book, okay?
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.